arrogant socialite, publicly slaps a black paramedic at the scene of a devastating crash, screaming that people like her don't belong near her family. Completely unaware, the woman she just humiliated is the secret wife of the most feared Korean Mafia boss in the underworld, and within minutes, her world begins to collapse. The neon lights of Seoul bled onto the wet asphalt, painting dark puddles with electric shades of red and blue. The night air was heavy with the acrid scent of burning rubber and gasoline, a visceral reminder of human fragility against the machine. At the center of the chaos, where a luxury sports car had been reduced to a mangled heap of metal against a concrete pole, time seemed to dictate its own rules. Sirens sliced through the urban fog. But for Zara Thompson, the world around her had plunged into an absolute focused silence. She knelt over the shattered glass, her paramedic uniform stained at the edges, her steady hands working with surgical precision. Beneath her skilled fingers, the young driver, heir to an empire that money couldn't protect from his own recklessness, was taking shallow breaths. Zara was a black woman in a homogeneous country, a professional who had long ago learned to forge veiled prejudice and curious stares into an armor of ice. Her calmness was her signature, her technique impeccable. While other paramedics contained the fuel leak and police tried to hold back a crowd of eager onlookers with their phones raised, Zara found the young man's vein, stabilizing his neck with movements that allowed no hesitation. It was then that the piercing sound of abruptly braking tires tore through the curtain of the crowd's murmurs. An imported sedan, polished like an onyx mirror, stopped mere meters from the isolation zone. The doors swung open before the vehicle even came to a complete halt, revealing a storm in the shape of a woman. Mrs. Park Soon-hee stepped out of the car cloaked in flawless designer wear, diamonds reflecting the emergency lights like tiny blades, and an aura of authority that demanded the world bow down. Flanked by 2 private bodyguards, she ignored the yellow tape and the police officers, driven by desperation and a blind arrogance forged by absolute power. When the socialite's eyes met the scene on the ground, the initial shock of seeing her bloodied son rapidly metamorphosed into something denser and darker. Her gaze swept over Zara, fixating on the paramedic's dark skin, on the gloved hands, cradling the face of her most precious asset. The cultural and class barrier rose right there, invisible but as thick as concrete. "Take your hands off him!" Mrs. Park's voice rang out sharp, heavy with an irrational repulsion. "Who are you? What do you think you're doing?" Zara didn't look up immediately. She checked the intravenous access, the boy's pulse, and only then tilted her face up slightly. Her voice emerged low, controlled, and unwavering. "Ma'am, your son has suffered severe trauma. I need you to step back so we can stabilize him and get him to the hospital alive." Zara's rationality was like fuel thrown onto the flames of the matriarch's wounded privilege. Mrs. Park took a step forward, her Italian designer heel crushing fragments of a broken headlight. The idea that this foreign woman, a mere emergency worker, was dictating the rules over the heir to her dynasty was an intolerable offense to her pride. "I demand someone appropriate," she shouted, gesturing toward the other Korean paramedics standing nearby in stunned silence. "People like you are not authorized to touch someone of our standing. Call the hospital's chief medical officer now." The crowd's cell phones captured every second, lenses multiplying the injustice and the insult. Zara felt the weight of the words, the cold blade of a public humiliation that wasn't new, but never failed to sting. Even so, her morality outweighed her pride. She looked directly into the furious eyes of the socialite. "My job is to save lives, ma'am. Your son's status will not keep him breathing if I let go of this airway." The raw, irrefutable truth was the final blow to Mrs. Park's sanity. Accustomed to a world where her will bent reality, being challenged with facts by someone she deemed inferior made her lose the last shred of her control. With a swift, impulsive motion, the socialite raised her right hand, heavy with rings, and delivered a violent slap to Zara's face. The crack was sharp, echoing above the wail of the sirens. The impact threw the paramedic's face to the side, and the metallic taste of blood instantly flooded her mouth as one of the rings cut her lower lip. The world seemed to freeze. The crowd held its breath. Cell phone flashes blinked frantically, recording the violence, the arrogance, the ruin of a flawless image. Zara closed her eyes for a brief, torturous second. The fire of anger threatened to melt the barrier of ice she kept around her heart, but she took a deep breath. Without uttering a single word, without returning the aggression, she turned her face back forward. She wiped away the drop of blood trickling down her chin with the back of her arm and resumed immobilizing the patient. Her dignity remained intact, a fortress no money could buy or destroy. What Mrs. Park Sunhai was ignorant of, intoxicated by her own sense of superiority, was the true magnitude of the colossal mistake she had just made. In the shadows, just a few steps away from the crowd illuminated by the flashes, a man dressed in a dark, discreet suit observed everything in sepulchral silence. He wasn't with the police, nor the hospital. He was the shadow designated to ensure that the wife of Kang Ji-hyun, the man whose mere mention made Seoul's financial and political underworld tremble, returned home safely every day. The bodyguard did not draw a weapon. He did not intervene. He knew his employer's rules were clear, strategic, and ruthless. With slow movements, he pulled a cell phone from the inner pocket of his suit jacket. The screen glowed faintly in the darkness as his fingers typed a single, lethal sentence, sending it straight to the top of the city's food chain. She was assaulted. The sterile scent of antiseptic and ether in the hospital corridors had always served as an anchor for Zara, but in the early hours of that morning, the aroma felt suffocating. The young heir, once an inert body trapped in the wreckage, was now breathing on his own in the intensive care unit, stabilized thanks to the decisions she had made on the wet asphalt. The adrenaline that had kept her standing during the rescue was finally beginning to recede, leaving in its wake an exhaustion that weighed heavily on every muscle. Standing before the locker room mirror, she observed her own reflection. The cut on her lower lip had stopped bleeding, but the skin around it was swollen and bruised purple. It wasn't the physical pain that bothered her, but the phantom echo of the crack, the memory of the public humiliation that still burned beneath her skin. The drive back home took place in a dense silence in the back seat of the dark car. The bodyguard drove with the precision of a ghost, his eyes fixed on the road, betraying none of the information he had already transmitted. Zara leaned her head against the cold glass of the window, watching the neon lights of Seoul blur into streaks of color. She was accustomed to the cold shoulders, the subtle prejudices, the systemic barriers of being a black woman in a society that valued uniformity. She had built a fortress of ice around her heart to survive it all. But the unprovoked hostility of Mrs. Park had breached the walls, leaving her feeling exposed and profoundly weary. The elevator doors opened directly into the penthouse, a sprawling sanctuary of glass, steel, and muted lighting that hovered high above the city's restless heartbeat. The contrast between her grueling reality of blood and sirens and the immaculate silent power of this space always struck her. Standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, bathed in the pale light of the impending dawn, was Kang Ji-hyun. He wore a simple dark shirt with the sleeves rolled up, a glass of amber liquid forgotten on the side table. He didn't turn immediately when she stepped in. He didn't need to. The shift in the air was enough for him to know she was there. When Ji-hyun finally turned, his gaze locked onto her with the intensity of a predator, yet his movements were deliberate and restrained. He crossed the vast living room, his footsteps making no sound on the plush rug. Zara stood her ground, her chin tilted slightly upward, maintaining the brave facade she wore for the rest of the world. But as he stepped into the light, his eyes immediately found the swollen, bruised flesh of her lip. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet. Ji-hyun was a man who commanded empires from the shadows, a man whose mere displeasure could bankrupt corporations. Yet, confronted with the mark of aggression on the woman he loved, he did not shout. He did not break the glass or tear the room apart. His reaction was a terrifying, absolute stillness. He reached out, his large, calloused hands hovering just a millimeter away from her cheek, afraid to cause her more pain. "Who?" The single word slipped from his lips, quiet, yet laced with a dark, freezing edge that made the hairs on her arms stand up. Zara gently placed her hand over his, pulling it down. The emotional barrier between them materialized, thick and palpable. "It's handled, Ji-hyun. The patient is alive. The police were there. I don't want you to do what you're thinking of doing." Her voice was tired, pleading for the sanctuary of normalcy. She feared the beast that slept beneath his tailored suits. She feared that his version of justice would twist into the very destruction she spent her life trying to fight against. "She struck you in front of the world," he replied, his voice a low rumble. "She looked at you and saw someone she could diminish without consequence. And if you retaliate with your usual methods, you prove to them that we are exactly what they think we are, dangerous. I heal people. I build. I don't want to be the reason someone's life is ruined." Ji-hyun looked deep into her eyes, seeing the exhaustion, the pride, and the trauma of a lifetime spent fighting for a place in a world that constantly tried to push her out. He slowly stepped back, the invisible wall between them growing taller. He wouldn't cross her boundaries, but he also couldn't let the offense stand. "Go to sleep, Zara. You've saved enough lives tonight." As she walked down the hall toward the bedroom, seeking the refuge of rest, Ji-hyun turned on his heel and walked into his study. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, sealing him in the dark. He sat behind his desk and opened his laptop. The digital world was already catching fire. The video of the slap was trending, spreading like a virus through the city's networks. He picked up his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen. He could use the fire of his underworld connections to physically threaten her, to make her disappear into the shadows. But Zara's words echoed in his mind. She didn't want a monster. She didn't want violence. If physical force was off the table, he would have to dismantle the socialite's world brick by brick. He would freeze her assets, expose her family's buried secrets, and sever her from the high society she valued more than oxygen. He pressed a single button, dialing his most trusted operative. As the first light of morning breached the horizon, illuminating the sleeping city, the gears of a merciless, invisible machine began to turn. The slap had echoed on the streets, but the avalanche it triggered was about to crush an empire. The digital realm is a landscape of dry brush, and the video of the slap was a spark that ignited a relentless fire. Within 24 hours, the incident on the rainy streets of Seoul had transcended local news, becoming a viral inferno of public outrage. The stark contrast between the paramedic's composed, life-saving focus and the socialite's unhinged arrogance painted a perfect portrait of inequality. From the pristine heights of his corporate stronghold, Kang Ji-hyun watched the flames consume Mrs. Park Sun-hee's carefully curated existence. He did not need to break laws to break a dynasty. He only needed to direct the light into the shadows they had spent decades cultivating. His influence was an invisible glacier, slowly and unstoppably crushing the foundations of her social standing. By the second day, the structural ruin began. An anonymous but impeccably documented dossier found its way to the compliance boards of 3 major charities, where Mrs. Park held influential positions. It detailed minor but embarrassing administrative irregularities, enough to force sudden, polite resignations for the sake of personal reflection. Invitations to exclusive galas were silently revoked. High-end brands that had once clamored to dress her suddenly found their public relations departments issuing statements about their commitment to respect and equality, effectively cutting ties in a matter of hours. Ji-hyun's intelligence network then turned its gaze toward her husband's corporate ventures. A series of perfectly legal, Highly scrutinized tax audits were mysteriously prioritized by regulatory agencies. Old, hushed-up civil complaints regarding their son's past reckless driving incidents were suddenly unsealed by journalists who had received anonymous tips. The pressure was a suffocating vice, turning the Park family's golden fortress into a prison of public scrutiny and financial instability. Ji-hoon moved the pieces on the board with the cold precision of a grandmaster, ensuring the destruction was systemic, clean, and absolutely devastating. Yet, the chill of this orchestrated ruin began to seep under the doors of his own home. Zara sat at the kitchen island of their penthouse, the glow of her tablet reflecting in her tired eyes. She scrolled through the endless headlines, the venomous comments directed at the woman who had struck her, and the sudden, precipitous collapse of the Park family empire. She was not naive. She knew the sheer velocity of this downfall was not the organic machinery of karma. It was the calculated architecture of her husband's power. When Ji-hoon entered the room, loosening the silk tie at his collar, he found her staring at the screen. The air between them, usually a sanctuary of shared warmth, felt brittle. "She issued a public apology," Zara said, her voice devoid of triumph. She didn't look up immediately. "A formal statement, begging for forgiveness from the medical community and from me." Ji-hoon poured a glass of water, his posture relaxed, but his eyes intensely focused on her. "It is the least she owes you. Words are cheap, Zara. The loss of her privilege is the true cost of her arrogance." Zara finally looked at him, and the emotional barrier they had erected 2 nights prior seemed to thicken into a wall of solid ice. "Is that what this is about? The cost? I see her husband's company is facing sudden audits. I see her son's past civil records being broadcasted on every news channel. You are dismantling her entire world." "I am taking away her ability to ever look down on another human being again," he replied, his tone even, though a flicker of defensive fire danced in his dark eyes. "I did not lay a finger on her. I did not harm her family. I simply removed the armor that allowed her to be cruel. By becoming a monster yourself." The question left her lips before she could stop it, sharp and heavy. The silence that followed was deafening. Ji-hoon's jaw tightened. He had restrained his darkest impulses. He had chosen the path of legal and social pressure precisely to honor her abhorrence of violence. He believed he was building a protective fortress around her, but she only saw the ashes of the world he was burning down. "You think this is vengeance?" he said softly, the pain of her misunderstanding tightening his chest. "I think it is a display of power that terrifies me," she confessed, her voice trembling slightly. "I heal people, Ji-hoon. I mend what is broken. When I look at the news, I don't see justice. I see a meticulous, cold-blooded annihilation. It makes me wonder where the line is. If you can erase a family's legacy so effortlessly, what happens when that power loses its compass?" The tension threatened the very foundation of their trust. Ji-hoon realized that in his desperate attempt to shield her, he was inadvertently showing her the very shadows she feared. The fire of his protection was melting the fragile ice of their security. He stepped closer, wanting to bridge the widening chasm, but she subtly pulled back, wrapping her arms around herself. "I need time," she whispered, turning her gaze back to the sprawling, indifferent city below. "I need to know that the man I married understands the difference between protecting my honor and destroying a life just because he can." Ji-hoon stood frozen. The master of a hidden empire suddenly powerless in his own home, realizing that his flawless victory in the world might cost him the only soul he cherished. The sprawling glass windows of the penthouse framed a city that moved in oblivious rhythm, its arteries of light pulsing through the dark. Inside, however, the air was stagnant, heavy with a silence that felt heavier than stone. For 3 days, the space between Zara and Ji-hoon had expanded from a subtle chill into a vast, uncrossable tundra. The fire of his protective instincts, which he had unleashed upon the Park family's empire, had perversely forged a wall of solid ice around his own marriage. Zara stood in the center of the bedroom, quietly folding a set of dark blue scrubs into a small duffel bag. The zipper echoed sharply in the quiet room. She was not fleeing, but the emotional rupture between them had become too suffocating to endure within those walls. She needed the sterile, grounded reality of the emergency ward, where the lines between saving and losing were dictated by biology, not by the ruthless machinery of corporate vengeance. Ji-hyun leaned against the doorframe, the impeccably tailored lines of his suit failing to mask the raw tension radiating from his posture. He watched her hands, the same hands that had healed a shattered boy on the asphalt, now packing to leave him, even if only temporarily. "You are retreating," he stated, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that barely masked his internal panic. "You are looking at me as if I am the danger." Zara paused, her hand resting on the canvas fabric of the bag. When she looked up, her eyes were swimming with an exhaustion that ran deeper than physical fatigue. "I am looking at a man who is using his influence to engineer a famine. You haven't broken a single law, Ji-hyun. The audits, the public exposures, the withdrawn sponsorships, it is all perfectly legal. But it is still a slaughter. You are meticulously dismantling a family's entire existence, and you are doing it in my name. I am showing them the consequence of their arrogance," he countered, stepping fully into the room. "Power without accountability is a plague, Zara." She believed her status made her untouchable. "I am simply proving that the ground she walks on can be dissolved. I am protecting you." "By isolating me?" she asked, her voice cracking slightly, the barrier of her composure finally showing hairline fractures. "When you wield your power to ruin, even legally, you validate their belief that the world is just a hierarchy of predators. I cannot be the catalyst for someone else's complete destruction. That is not justice, Ji-hyun. That is revenge dressed in an expensive suit." She slung the bag over her shoulder, closing the physical distance between them, only to pass by him. The scent of her, clean soap and rain, lingered as she walked down the hallway. "I need space. I am taking the on-call dorm at the hospital for the next few days. I need to figure out if the man I love is a builder or just a very articulate demolition machine." The soft click of the front door closing behind her was the loudest sound Ji-hyun had ever heard. The undisputed master of Seoul's corporate shadows stood paralyzed in the center of his immaculate home, realizing that his flawless victory over an enemy had triggered the catastrophic collapse of his own heart. Hours later, the emotional debris of that morning hardened into a cold, dangerous focus as Ji-hyun sat behind the expansive oak desk of his corporate headquarters. The glass tower pierced the gray morning sky, a monument to the staggering influence he commanded. His assistant opened the heavy double doors, ushering in a visitor who looked entirely out of place in the austere, modern environment. Mrs. Park Soon-hee stepped into the office. The woman who had commanded the streets with diamond-clad arrogance just days prior was now a hollowed-out ghost. Her designer coat hung loosely on her trembling shoulders. Her eyes were red-rimmed and frantic. She had bypassed his legendary security only because he had expressly permitted it. She had finally connected the invisible dots of her family's sudden, catastrophic downfall to the quiet man whose wife she had publicly humiliated. "Please," the socialite choked out, abandoning all pretense of dignity as she stood before his desk. She did not sit. She looked at the man who held the oxygen line to her family's legacy. "The banks have frozen the credit lines for my husband's firm. The board is demanding his resignation by tomorrow morning. We are losing everything. I came to apologize. I will get on my knees if I have to." Ji-hyun did not blink. His expression was carved from marble. On the desk between them rested a single, thick leather folder. Inside was a fully legal, highly aggressive acquisition drafted by his legal team. With one signature, his conglomerate would absorb the Park family's core company at a fraction of its value, assuming its debts and liquidating its assets. It was the final strike. It would leave them destitute, a permanent exile from the elite society they worshipped. "You did not come to apologize for your cruelty," Ji-hyun said, his voice quiet, lacking any heat, which only made it more terrifying. "You came to apologize because you suddenly realized there are predators larger than you in the ecosystem." He rested his hand on the leather folder. The power to annihilate was right beneath his fingertips. He could end the bloodline's relevance forever. It was the ultimate vengeance, clean and absolute. But as he looked at the trembling, broken woman, the phantom echo of Zara's voice filled the room. "I heal people. I mend what is broken." The crisis tore at his core. If he signed the document, he would win the war, but he would permanently become the monster his wife feared. The misunderstanding of what it meant to protect someone hovered over them like a blade. He stared at the pen, the weight of a moral choice pressing down on his soul, caught between the intoxicating pull of absolute ruin and the desperate hope of salvation. The titanium pen felt heavier than a physical weapon in Ji-hyun's hand. The polished surface of the mahogany desk reflected the gray, overcast sky of Seoul, mirroring the tempest of conflicting absolutes within his own mind. Across from him, Mrs. Park Soon-hye, the architect of her own spectacular unraveling, shrank into the plush leather of the guest chair. The silence in the cavernous office was absolute, thick with the scent of ozone and impending ruin. She was staring at the leather folder, knowing it contained the legal instruments of her family's total annihilation. The hostile takeover documents required only his signature to absorb her husband's conglomerate, liquidate its assets, and cast her bloodline into the freezing abyss of financial and social obscurity. For a man who had spent his life operating in the shadows, orchestrating outcomes with the cold precision of a grandmaster, this was the ultimate flawless victory. Yet the victory tasted like ash. Ji-hyun looked away from the trembling socialite and turned his gaze toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. Beyond the glass, the city was a sprawling matrix of concrete and steel, indifferent to the lives being built or broken within it. He saw the reflection of his own face in the pane, but the eyes staring back belonged to the monster Zara feared. She had walked out of their sanctuary because he had mistaken destruction for protection. He had unleashed a fire that was meant to burn their enemies, but the smoke had suffocated his own home. "You are not sorry for what you did," Ji-hyun finally spoke, his voice dropping the temperature in the room by several degrees. He didn't raise his tone, he didn't need to. "You are not tormented by the fact that you publicly humiliated a woman who was actively keeping your son's heart beating. You are only terrified because you discovered who she comes home to." Mrs. Park flinched, a ragged sob escaping her lips. She clasped her hands together, the heavy diamond rings that had cut Zara's lip now conspicuously absent, sold or hidden away in the wake of her frozen assets. "I was wrong," she wept, her pride entirely dissolved. "I was arrogant. But please, do not punish my entire family for my momentary madness. Do not erase us." He slowly turned his chair back to face her. His dark eyes were devoid of sympathy. But the lethal edge that usually defined his business dealings had shifted into something far more profound. He realized, in that crystallizing moment, that power without a moral compass was merely a different form of violence. To sign the paper was to validate Mrs. Park's worldview, that the strong simply devour the weak. If he crushed her completely, he would permanently sever the fragile tether that still connected him to Zara's light. To completely dismantle your family's financial existence would be a definitive end, Ji-hyun said, his voice a low, steady rumble. A permanent exile into the poverty you so deeply despise. I could do it with a single stroke of this pen. You would lose your homes, your legacy, and the very ground you walk on. He watched the color completely drain from her face. She was bracing for the executioner's blow. Instead, Ji-hyun deliberately set the pen down. He closed the thick leather folder, with a soft, definitive thud and pushed it to the far corner of his desk. "But I will not do that," he stated. Mrs. Park blinked, the shock of the reprieve paralyzing her vocal cords. "I am not going to destroy your husband's company, nor will I leave your family destitute," Ji-hyun continued, leaning forward, the architecture of his power now shifting from ruin to absolute control. "However, the world you knew is over. You will face a permanent loss of influence. The social protections you believed made you untouchable are gone." He opened a secondary, much thinner folder, sliding a single sheet of paper toward her. "These are the conditions of your survival. First, your public apologies will no longer be hollow PR statements. You will make a substantial, irrevocable financial endowment to a new foundation dedicated to the legal and psychological protection of emergency and foreign workers in this city. Second, you will permanently step down from every charitable board, every social committee, and every position of public influence you currently hold. You will live a quiet, invisible life. If you attempt to reclaim your status, or if you ever leverage your wealth to diminish another human being again, the folder in the corner of my desk will be signed before you can draw your next breath." The socialite stared at the paper, tears of profound relief and bitter defeat spilling over her cheeks. She nodded frantically, her hands shaking as she reached for the document. She had lost her crown, but she had kept her life and her family's survival. As Mrs. Park was escorted out of the office, a hollowed shell of her former arrogance, Ji-hyun remained alone in the vast silence. He looked at his own hands. For the first time in his life, he had possessed the absolute justification and the power to obliterate an enemy, and he had chosen not to. He had chosen restraint over revenge. He had chosen to pivot the immense machinery of his influence away from a scorched earth campaign and toward something entirely new. He picked up his phone, dialing his lead corporate attorney. The fire of his anger had cooled, replaced by the steady, enduring warmth of a new purpose. "Draft the articles of incorporation for a new support center," Ji-hyun instructed, his voice clear and resolute. "And prepare to clear a schedule. We are no longer just tearing down liabilities. We are going to build a sanctuary." The moral choice had been made. Now, he just had to prove to the woman he loved that the ice could melt and the ground he had scorched could bloom once more. The fluorescent lights of the hospital break room hummed with a sterile, relentless energy, casting long, exhausted shadows across the linoleum floor. Zara sat alone at a small, scuffed table, a paper cup of lukewarm coffee resting between her hands. 3 days had passed since she walked out of the penthouse. 3 days of double shifts, of focusing on the fragile rhythm of heart monitors and the mechanical hiss of ventilators. Healing others had always been her sanctuary, the place where she made sense of a chaotic world. But the silence in her own chest was deafening. The ice she had built to protect herself from the city's prejudice was now freezing her from the inside out, isolating her from the man she loved. She stared at her reflection in the dark liquid of her coffee. She missed Ji-hyun's quiet strength, the way his mere presence could anchor her. But the fear of what his power could unleash, the fire that could reduce a family to ashes, had forced her to step back. She needed a partner, not an executioner. The sound of the break room door opening softly broke her reverie. Zara didn't need to look up to know who had entered. The sudden shift in the air, the subtle scent of sandalwood and cold night rain, announced him before he even spoke. Ji-hyun stood in the doorway. He was not wearing his armor of bespoke charcoal wool and silk ties. Instead, he wore a simple dark sweater and an overcoat, looking stripped down, vulnerable in a way the corporate world never saw. He looked like a man who had crossed a vast, freezing wasteland to find his way home. He did not cross the room immediately, respecting the boundary she had drawn. "I am not here to ask you to come back," Ji-hyun said, his voice a low, resonant murmur that vibrated over the hum of the vending machines. "I am here to show you what I chose to do with the fire you feared." Zara slowly lifted her gaze. The exhaustion etched around his eyes mirrored her own. She saw no triumph in his posture, no arrogance of a predator who had just devoured its prey. She saw only a profound, quiet clarity. Ji-hyun stepped forward, stopping at the edge of the table. From the inner pocket of his coat, he withdrew a thick manila envelope and gently placed it on the scratched surface between them. It was not a dossier of ruin, nor a contract of acquisition. "Mrs. Park Sun-hee came to my office yesterday," he began, his tone steady. "She was broken, terrified that I was going to liquidate her husband's company and leave her family destitute. I had the documents drafted. I had the power to erase them from this city permanently." He paused, his dark eyes locking onto hers, pleading for her to understand the magnitude of his next words. "But I put the pen down. I did not sign them." Zara's breath hitched, her hands tightening around the paper cup. "I realized," he continued, taking a step closer, "that if I destroyed them completely, I would only be proving her right. I would be using my influence the exact same way she used hers, as a weapon to crush those beneath me. I would become the monster you walked away from. So I stripped her of her public influence. I removed her from the boards and the charities. She can no longer use her status as a shield to harm others. But her family remains intact. They will not lose their home. They will simply have to live without the privilege they abused." He gestured to the envelope. "Open it." With trembling fingers, Zara reached out and slid the heavy parchment papers from the envelope. They were not legal threats. They were architectural blueprints and articles of incorporation. At the top of the first page, embossed in bold letters, was the name, the Aegis Center for Emergency and Migrant Workers. "Instead of spending my resources to dismantle their legacy, I used them to build one for you," Ji-hyun said, his voice softening, the cold edge melting into a profound warmth. "It is a fully funded foundation. It will provide free, top-tier legal representation, psychological counseling, and medical care for any foreign worker or emergency responder who faces prejudice, assault, or systemic abuse in this city. A sanctuary. And it is funded in large part by a mandatory irrevocable endowment from Mrs. Park herself." Zara stared at the blueprints, the meticulously detailed plans for consultation rooms, therapy gardens, and legal offices. The words blurred as tears finally breached the walls of ice she had maintained for so long. The slap that had humiliated her on the street, the incident that was meant to diminish her existence, had just been transformed into a fortress of protection for hundreds of others. He had not burned the world down for her. He had built a shelter in the middle of the storm. Ji-hyun finally closed the distance between them. He knelt beside her chair, placing his large, warm hands over hers. The touch sent a shockwave of relief through her system. "You told me you heal people. You mend what is broken," he whispered, looking up at her with a fierce, unwavering devotion. "Teach me how to build, Zara. I do not want to be a machine of ruin. I want to be the ground you stand on." The barrier between them shattered completely, not with violence, but with the gentle, unstoppable force of spring thawing the winter ice. Zara leaned down, resting her forehead against his, her tears dampening his cheek. In the sterile, quiet room of the hospital, the dark king of soul's shadows had laid down his crown of fear, choosing instead to forge a legacy of light, guided entirely by the woman who held his heart. The autumn morning sun bathed the sprawling streets of Seoul in a golden crystalline light, offering an absolute and poetic contrast to the dark, chaotic, and rain-swept night from 6 months prior. Where there had once been only the cold, impersonal gray of a forgotten commercial block, a stunning structure of translucent glass and warm, light wood now stood. The building had been meticulously designed, not to intimidate with the towering, monolithic height of corporate skyscrapers, but to welcome with the expansive breadth of its brightly illuminated spaces. The wide double doors of the Aegis Center for Emergency and Migrant Workers were propped open, breathing life, dignity, and a profound new purpose into the constantly moving, restless metropolis. The broad sidewalk out front was not overrun by eager onlookers, thirsty for a scandal, nor were there frantic cell phone lenses seeking to record another's ruin. Instead, the space was filled with paramedics in their off-duty uniforms, nurses, immigrant laborers, social workers, and human rights advocates forming a palpable, living network of solidarity. There were smiles of profound relief, animated conversations flowing seamlessly in multiple languages, and a deep, resonant sense of security that seemed, at long last, to melt the systemic ice of prejudice that had for so long frozen the margins of that society. Standing in the center of the entrance courtyard, Zara Thompson observed the striking facade of the building. She was no longer wearing the blood and asphalt-stained uniform of that fateful night. Instead, she wore an impeccably tailored white suit, a deliberate symbol of the light and the new authority she had assumed as the founding director of the project. The faint, almost invisible scar on her lower lip was the sole physical remnant of the impact that, in a fleeting moment of blind arrogance, had attempted to diminish her entire existence. At her side, Kang Ji-hyun remained as a silent, imposing anchor. He had shed the aura of the ruthless predator that used to paralyze corporate boardrooms, replacing it with a posture of serene, unshakable strength. The terrifying fire of his immense influence, once used exclusively to carbonize rival empires and silence opponents, now fueled the thermal foundation of something perennial and vital. "Are you nervous?" Ji-hyun's voice sounded low, an intimate murmur that effortlessly cut through the festive, vibrant hum of the crowd around them. He gently intertwined his fingers with hers, his warm, secure touch transmitting a language of devotion that went far beyond mere words. Zara looked down at their joined hands. The stark contrast between her dark skin and his pale complexion seemed to serve as a visual metaphor for everything they had overcome. The cultural barriers, the silenced fears, and the heavy defensive walls that each had erected to survive a hostile world. "I am not nervous," she replied, her eyes shining with a profound, anchoring peace as she looked up into her husband's face. "I am in awe. We took the ugliest, most humiliating moment of my professional life and transformed it into the bedrock of all this. You transformed your power, Ji-hyun. You didn't burn the world down. You illuminated it." He lifted her hand to his lips, a soft, lingering kiss that carried the weight of months of emotional reconstruction and unrestricted devotion. The deep crisis in their marriage had forced them to reevaluate the very essence of what it meant to protect someone. Ji-hyun had learned, through the painful crucible of almost losing her, that true strength did not reside in the capacity to annihilate those who hurt them, but rather in the monumental courage to build sanctuaries where fear could not enter. Zara, in turn, had come to understand that she didn't need to face the storms of the world entirely alone, wrapped tightly in a solitary armor of ice. They were now the perfect equilibrium, the surgical precision of her healing care guiding the unshakable architecture of his protection. The master of ceremonies called Zara to the podium. Ji-hyun released his wife's hand and took a respectful step back with a proud, quiet smile, allowing the morning sun to fall entirely upon the woman he loved. As she adjusted the microphone, Zara looked out over the silent, attentive crowd. She saw the faces of people who intimately knew the humiliation of veiled aggressions, the bone-deep exhaustion of endless shifts, and the crushing weight of social invisibility. 6 months ago, the noise of the sirens in this city was abruptly interrupted by an act of public violence. Zara began, her voice firm, clear, and resonant, echoing beautifully across the plaza. That gesture was intended to remind me of my place, and in a way, it successfully fulfilled its purpose. She paused, allowing the heavy weight of that memory to settle gently over the audience before smiling with an unshakable, radiant strength. "Because my place is exactly here. Our place is here." We are so often taught that power is measured by status, by wealth, or by whom you can humiliate without suffering any consequences. But true power, the kind that echoes across generations, is measured exclusively by how many people you can uplift. This center is the physical proof that pain can be the foundation for dignity. Where arrogance attempted to plant the seeds of ruin, we chose to construct. The applause that followed was deafening, a massive wave of human warmth and hope that swept down the street, drowning out the phantom echo of that slap forever. Not far from there, in a quiet, secluded suburb, far removed from the flashing spotlights of high society, a once untouchable woman watched the speech on her computer screen. The financial funds that had once financed her extravagant vanity now paid for the lawyers and psychologists of the very workers she had deemed inferior. The vicious cycle of humiliation had been broken at its root, replaced by an irrefutable legacy of restorative justice. Zara stepped down from the podium and walked toward the wide ceremonial ribbon stretched taut before the glass doors. Ji-Hyun approached, and his large hands rested over hers on the ceremonial scissors, a deeply symbolic gesture of the union of their strengths. With a clean, precise cut, the ribbon fell, and the doors of the Aegis Center were officially opened to the city. As the crowd began to flow joyfully into the natural, light-bathed building, Ji-Hyun pulled Zara into a deep, enveloping embrace. The crisp autumn wind blew around them, but there was no more cold. The incident that had begun with the absolute worst facet of human arrogance had culminated as a monumental symbol of redemption. Power devoid of empathy was merely empty violence, but power guided by love and purpose had entirely redefined the moral horizon of a metropolis. And the woman who had kept working on the wet asphalt had not been reduced by that slap. She had become, absolutely and undeniably, the architect of a change that no one saw coming.